the fact that we passed the House version of the budget bill, HB1 and HB2. Then it went to the Senate. They've made a lot of changes, and the expert that's going to brief on those now is our legislative budget assistant, Michael Kane, and his staff that we couldn't do a budget without them are all here handing out papers, so you'll have something to look at when he briefs it. Take it away, Mr. Kane.
Thank you very much, Chairman Weiler. Just for the record, and those who don't know me, my name is Michael Kane, and I'm the Legislative Budget Assistant for the state of New Hampshire. As Representative Weiler stated, we worked with the House in the month of March and the beginning of April to pass their budget, your budget, and then we worked with the Senate in April all the way through June, and actually they meet tomorrow to take a vote on their budget, so we're still technically working with the Senate. I'm going to go over the Senate Finance Committee recommendation. I can tell you right now that, as you know, there will be floor amendments, there'll be debate, there'll be other negotiations going on as I'm talking. So this may change, but this is going to get the 99% of what they're going to work off of. So Senate Finance, if we turn to page 1, both the House and the Senate had a beginning balance from 23 of $361.4 million in the General and Education Trust Fund. The total revenues estimated, Senate had 3,177.9, so it's almost $60 million over what the House had. And we talked about during the House phase is the Senate, it has the benefit of later revenue collections in the March and April revenue collections, which are your two largest months for business taxes, meals and rooms, et cetera. So they did have additional revenue. Total appropriations, the Senate also had lapsing. There was about $30 million that lapsed from House Bill 2023, which was the energy relief bill that was passed last fall, and $30 million of that will lapse. So the Senate was a benefit of that lapse. So those two amounts right there was over $100 million that the Senate had in the general fund, in Education Trust Fund, that the House did not. Total appropriations for the Senate about 3.3, leaving a cumulative ending balance of about 201.8. The transfer to the rainy day fund was $68.7 million is the current estimate. It was 69.7, but then the Senate did pass the bail status system bill in House Bill 610 of $1 million that took them down from when Finance had it. So 68.7, bringing your rainy day fund balance to 228.6 at the end of 23. Your balance after transfers, since it's a combined statement, this is your Education Trust Fund. Anything remaining at the end of the fiscal year in the Education Trust Fund carries forward into the next fiscal year. Any balance remaining in the general fund at the end of a biennium has to be transferred to the rainy day fund unless suspended by the legislature. It wasn't, so that will add $68.7 million to the current $159.9 million balance, bringing it to 228.6. We're still going to watch. We're only in June, the beginning of June. There's going to be June revenue collections. We know that the Senate Ways and Means revenue estimates, if the state hits plan in June for revenue collections, they'll be at the Senate estimates almost to the dollar. So as we get through the middle of the month, if you start to see that the revenue estimates are above for the month of June, that's additional money that's going to go into the rainy day fund or carry forward to the Education Trust Fund, depending on its source. So for 24, the only beginning balance is the Education Trust Fund. House had about 183.8, Senate 133.1, and I'll show you why they had that reduction when we get to those lines. Total revenues, House had 3,127.9, Senate had 3,194, so almost $67 million of additional revenues over the House. Total appropriations, the House had 3.165, Senate Finance 3.097, close to 3.1. Cumulative ending balance at the end of 24, the next fiscal year, 229.4 between the General Education Trust Fund. The general fund share is $42 million, and the Education Trust Fund share is $187.8 million. And before I go on, one of the big reasons, we'll start to see it when I have a separate General and Education Trust Fund revenue, there's a difference between the amount of business taxes that the House proposed going to the General and Education Trust Fund. Remember, the House had 77.5% of all business tax collections going into the general fund and 22.5% staying in the Education Trust Fund. The Senate kept the splits, or put the splits in statute at 59-41, which is the current law. It's roughly the current law percentages that are split between the general and education trust fund. As a result, as we get to 25, you'll see that the Senate's going to have a much larger balance in the education trust fund than the House did. Main reason is because of that business tax split decision that they had. So beginning in 25, a beginning balance of 229.9 in the Senate compared to 145.7 in the House. Additional revenues over the House, the Senate Ways and Means Committee estimated 3.165 versus 3.11, so that's another $55 million of additional general education trust fund than what the House had when they were developing their budget. Cumulative ending balance at 239.5. The House had 5.4. However, the general fund share of the balance is 3.2 million of that 239.5. That general fund balance compared to a House balance of 5.4 million. Senate did not suspend the rainy day provision, so the 3.2 goes into the rainy day fund, bringing that balance to approximately 231.8. The 236.2 is what stays in the education trust fund. So that's at the end of 25, based on the current revenue estimates, based on the current education funding proposal and other uses of the education trust fund. That's the balance that the Senate leaves the ETF with. So you've probably read or heard, even if you were following Senate Finance, Senate President, with a couple of his statements in public about reducing the House's budget by almost $750 million. So how did they do that? We have, and just to kind of step back a little bit, when the Senate began their budget process in April, they still wanted to wait until the end of April before they made any of their final decisions so they could see revenues. The Senate, as you know, typically gets higher revenues because they have the later revenue estimates, but they began the process saying that we need to cut the House's budget. So this was the Senate when they discussed in public, we're going to try to reduce the House's budget. This was before knowing what revenues were. They were comfortable getting below the governor's number, getting below the House's number, but they wanted to get there in a way where they could still support a lot of the House initiatives and do things typically what the Senate does. And as I get to those, I can show you. There's a couple mechanisms that are used to bring the total budget down. And as we get to those lines, I can let you know. One of them, if you look on row 4, it's just an example. One way to bring the 24-25 budget down is to fund any one-time cost into 23. And because the revenues for 23 were so robust, with the over 480 over plan, probably going to push over 500 over plan for 23. Even though the legislature appropriated almost $200 million in 22 out of that balance, they were able to absorb some of those costs. And so you can see in row 4 where you'll see an addition of $1.2 million for moving and fit-up costs for DAS, Administrative Services, and you can see a reduction in 24-25. So that's one way they're getting down to that $750 million figure, that the goal they set for themselves. You can see another repeat, DAS maintenance. There were some maintenance fund costs that the House did provide, $3.6 million. The Senate decided to support that, but to fund it in 23. Again, just those two items alone brought down the DAS appropriations by about $4.8 million, but the House and the Senate both get to the same endpoint. You'll see on row 9, House Bill 1 to House Bill 2, case management system. House decided to fund a case management system for the child advocate in 24-25. Senate supported that, but funded it out of FY23 funds, so that's the 201. And then we get to the big numbers. How did you get to $750 million? You would probably think you would open up the budget and see large cuts, a lot of the programs that you put in that are gone. On row 13, the Meals and Rooms distribution has statutory authority. There's a separate fund to distribute the meals and rooms to the cities and towns, and that exists off budget. It existed off budget in 22 and 23. So as you were hearing things about budget growth, the House was actually taking a hit of almost $240 million for showing an item that was off budget coming on budget in 24-25. The Senate decided to keep status quo. So what they did is they removed the appropriation authority in House Bill 1, recognizing that they already have the statutory authority to appropriate all these funds and distribute them to cities and towns off budget with the current statute. It also pulls out one of the things that the Senate talked about during their deliberations was when you have a meals and rooms distribution or any distribution, we have a percentage of tax restricted for a certain purpose. As you're developing your next budget or your next budget, you need money somewhere. Maybe you have a general fund shortfall. You're going to look to those restricted accounts to try to grab that general fund revenue. To have this off budget was a big decision that the Senate made, and that's one of the main reasons why they made it. On row 14, the Treasury, a sheeted property. So these are all the abandoned claims or the abandoned property that individuals who they have a right to. Usually this is an open general fund warrant that's off book. You don't see it. I'll show it to you on your Schedule 2, where we'll account for it during the budget process of these general fund appropriations. But the treasurer put that into House Bill 1 and 2, and so that brought the budget up by about $5.2 million over the biennium. However, that statutory authority already exists. What the Senate do is they did set up an account for a sheeted property in the budget of $1. So when we get to the 26-27 budget and the next biennium, you'll see at least historically what they paid. But that is something historically has been off budget for decades. And the treasurer came and worked with the Senate Finance Committee to get language in to still accomplish what she was trying to accomplish with that. If I go to row 15, reduce the Affordable Housing Fund to $20 million. The House had $30 million to the Affordable Housing Fund. The Senate reduced that to $10 million. It's hard for me to comment on the reasons why they make that reduction. You can talk to the individual senators, but there was discussed that right now you have $5 million of real estate transfer tax that is transferred into the Affordable Housing Fund every fiscal year. So that's taken out of your general fund revenues already. And so in recognition of that $10 million that's already going into the Affordable Housing Fund over the biennium, the Senate reduced by $10 million. That was one of the reasons they used. 17, the Group 2 transition provisions. These are the Group 2 changes to the Group 2 retirement provisions that went back to the pre-2011 or 2011 statute when they made all those changes in the retirement. That was a $50 million cost for the House. Well, to get the budget down, that was one of the large items that the Senate discussed and debated, one of the last items that they made a decision on in Senate Finance, which will still be debated tomorrow when they have the budget come before them. But they removed that change, and they did establish a study commission with 4 senators, 4 House members, and various other parties to look at not only this issue, but various other issues impacting the retirement system, as well as retention of state employees through retirement benefits. The next line, 18, deletes the pay down of the UAAL, the unfunded actuarial acute liability in the retirement system. There's close to $6 billion. The House put $50 million in general funds to pay that down. The Senate removed that, and then you'll see them allocating various other appropriations. So they had a decision to make. Do we support that? Where do we want our rainy day fund to be at the end of 23, and how does this play into our full picture? So there's a lot of meetings, a lot of discussions that are happening. I'm involved in some, not involved in others, just to try to get the Senate comes up with a plan and tries to get to where they're all comfortable with at the end. And so that was one that fell down on the priority scale with the Senate. On row 19, New Hampshire retirement system, amending the Group 2 COLA. Group 2 had a COLA put in by Division 1 that cost about $9 million. The Senate decided to instead, I think they did it a few years ago, where it's a $500 one-time allowance for those retirees who have been retired for 5 years, who are Group 1 or Group 2, and who have at least 20 years of credible service, pension benefits under $40,000 or under. They'll receive a one-time $500 payment. That one-time allowance is $7 million versus the House $9 million of the Group 2, so there's the $2 million difference there. And I won't go through every single one of these, so don't worry. Row 20 is $200,000 of Senate Bill 125 relative to regional economic development grants with an annual appropriation, and so that was one thing that they did put into 24 and 25. When we go to Category 2, Administration of Justice and Public Protection, there was some small changes for the judicial branch, about $750,000. There was but one drug court that the judicial branch forgot to fund and didn't notify the House. The Senate was notified and were able to provide funds so that each county can have their drug court. The funds farm ranch stress assistance, $200,000. That was the Commissioner of Agriculture coming to Senate Finance and requesting additional funds that weren't requested from the House. Row 29, $3 million to child advocacy centers. That was a big add in 23 for 23 surplus funds that the Senate did. And just to kind of step back a little bit, when you're appropriating 23 funds, when the legislature appropriating 23 funds, what they do is they hit your current surplus for the current fiscal year and then make those funds non-lapsing until the next biennium. But what you're doing is you're basically grabbing those before they go into the rainy day fund. That's what 23 appropriations do from the general fund. So there's $300 million there. Internet crimes against children, $800,000. That's on row 31. And then I'm just going to skip some of the bigger ones. But if we go to on row 35, you remember House Bill 639. This is cannabis legislation. It was something that had an appropriation that passed after the House Finance Committee had adopted their budget. This was a separate bill, went through Ways and Means and passed and had almost a $15.6 million general fund appropriation. With the Senate's position and vote on that bill, because it's ITL, they were able to save, when you compare House to Senate on the surplus statement, about $15.6 million, just because that bill right now did not pass. Rows 36, rows and 37 are relative to, again, similar to Ways and Means, a lot smaller scale, but renewable energy funding, Greenhouse Energy Efficiency Fund, right now has statutory authority to spend, to appropriate, and everything, so it's separate than a lot in House Bill 1, which are the initial authorizations for spending. It already exists, and so the Senate removed those, understanding that those funds are still going to continue to operate as they do now. It does bring them down closer to that budget goal that they set for themselves. 40 is the surplus statement adjustment on our side on the LBA, so you'll see an increase in the lapse, and I'll get to that in a little bit. And that has to do with the energy bill that passed, and 30 million of those funds not utilized. On page 3, so rows 42 through 46, I'll talk to kind of all at once. This is the Judicial Council, so those members on House Finance that have been here for a while know that when the Judicial Council comes in, one of the areas which would be reduced first for general funds was the Judicial Council, and the reason for that is because the Judicial Council can come back, they're one of the few agencies that can come back to the Fiscal Committee and request additional general funds if their appropriations are not sufficient. So the Senate, in recognition of that, reduced their budget, not to the 22-23 levels, it reduced it to their 23 actuals, which are what they were appropriated plus what they came through the Fiscal Committee. So you can see on rows 42, about a $2 million reduction a year, and then some smaller ones. And then you're going to see on 45 and 46. And so what happened here is that the Senate did reduce the public defender and did reduce abuse and neglect fund, contract counsel by about 1.2 million for contract counsel, another 5.6 in the public defender. But Judicial Council came back and they asked the Senate if they'd reconsider that action, if they would put the funds in. The Senate was still holding firm that we'll give you what we got in 23, and you can come back to fiscal, and negotiations continued. And then you'll see in 23 that the final decision made by the committee was almost $6.8 million in the current surplus funds that can be used by the contract counsel and public defender if their budget is not sufficient. So it's kind of getting to it now instead of coming back to fiscal later for those two lines. Big reason for the public defender, as you all know, is that is a contract. The public defender does have issues with finding attorneys and compensating attorneys to provide that defense, and so that was one area they were willing to fund. 50 and 51 is more just a reflection of the legislative process. There are items in House Bill 1 and 2 that may also have a separate bill going through the legislative process, and depending what happens to that bill, there's going to be some actions in House Bill 1 and 2 and vice versa. Here's one where you'll have on row 50, $1 million removed to the bail condition status system from House Bill 2. So that, when we did the initial Senate Finance surplus statement, it was a little, the appropriations were $1 million lower, but because in row 51 in House Bill 610, there was a floor amendment that passed on the Senate floor the next day to fund that system out of that bill. So it's something that came back onto our surplus statement. And that's how, if you were to look at the 531 surplus statement and the 62, that's the change right there. And then there was another bill that I can talk to after about, but it had to do with the Department of Environmental Services, a Division 1 bill that was retained, so that saved about $250,000 from the Senate position back on last week. Northern Border Alliance was added back. That is something, as you remember, it was in the governor's proposal, deleted in the House proposal. Senate right now has $1.4 million. Again, this is the Senate Finance budget proposal. There will be discussion on all these items tomorrow. I'm sure there'll be floor amendments on some of these items as well. Row 53 is funding DMV protective glass. It was $100,000. DMV came in and had close to $7 million of requests. The House thought, the Senate Finance will give you your most important, so priority-wise was to get that protective glass. Row 57. On row 60, the Fish and Game Fund. Fish and Game Fund ended the House budget with a positive balance. I think it was in the $4 to $5 million range. Fish and Game came back to the Senate and asked them to fund the pay raise. So can you fund, instead of having Fish and Game fund the pay raise, that is in House Bill 2, can you fund that for Fish and Game so we don't have to use Fish and Game funds? Revenues are pretty flat. And the Senate said no. And that was the end of it for a week until right near the end. They continued to have those conversations, and instead of providing the money specifically to the pay increase, which would have been basically opened up the box of the highway fund and all the other dedicated funds, what they did decide to do was provide a general fund support to the Fish and Game Fund to leave a bigger cushion at the end of the biennium in the event that revenues in Fish and Game do go down. Reduced Invest New Hampshire on row 64. I think the governor had 30 million, House had 15 million. This drops it down to $10 million. One of those reasons is you're going to see coming up under HHS, instead of funding Invest New Hampshire, they decided to fund a Housing Champion program, which is actually 2 below, but also $10 million. They received a lot of requests for shelter rates at homeless shelters and also for cold weather shelters and hotel stays. And so instead of funding the Affordable Housing Fund and Invest New Hampshire, they decided to fund these other programs. You can see that $5 million on row 66 funding housing program, the Housing Champions program, which I believe was Senator Perkins Coelho's bill, which was higher. I think it was in the $29 million range. Well, what they decided to do is to offset that Invest New Hampshire with funding that new program, see how it works, and then have a discussion at a later date. Up to 65 is a pulp and paper stabilization. Senate Finance was approached by a couple of the former paper factories or the mills up in the North Country. I think there's one in the western part of the state too, on trying to help them with that industry since they are taking a hit. And so the Senate did decide to provide $1.5 million of 23 to fund that. Row 68, the Chris McAuliffe Memorial. The Senate moved it back to what the governor had, about $500,000. They deleted the state library book removal funding of $1 million that was funded in the governor and the House. They added funds for the Northwood Meadows Dam of $1 million. They added funds for $18 million. These are all out of surplus for the Cannon Mountain Tramway, which is a separate Senate bill that the Senate tabled. And the Senate was in a similar position as the House. House Finance will definitely remember they had 50-plus bills before them as they're debating the budget. There was over $3 billion of appropriation bills that came in addition to the budget. And so the House and Senate had an extra task to go through and to prioritize which ones they wanted to fund. What the Senate does is they'll pass it out of the committee and then table it on the floor and discuss it in the budget. So the Cannon Mountain was one of those. Hampton Beach Pier Study. There was $2 million that was tabled. They decided to give $150,000 for the Hampton Beach Pier Study, but more focused on accessibility of Hampton Beach State Park for all users. Row 75 is the Hazardous Waste Cleanup Fund. Statutory authority already exists. And then you're going to see from row 76 through 80, removal of federal funds from the budget. In total, that's over $100 million of federal funds that the Senate removed from the budget, understanding that, number one, these are drinking and clean water state revolving loan funds from the federal government related to the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act. So these aren't your standard run-of-the-mill annual clean water, drinking water federal funds. These are specifically related to the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. As a result, because they are temporary, the Senate removed them out, understanding that DES can come back to fiscal committee for that. So just between the meals and rooms change and this change, that's close to 200, about 100. almost $350 million with those two line items alone, moving the meals and rooms back off budget and taking these out. So that gets them to their $750 million cut that they ended up coming to. Food 81 and 82, you remember that the House funded a food waste disposal position, about $100,000 in 25. The Senate removed that, and they funded the solid waste management fund at $1 million instead of $2 million, but they also allowed that fund to be used to fund that food waste disposal position. So it just shows a different way to get there with a lower dollar amount that they're willing to provide. On page 4, these are all new. When you see some of these lines, 83, 84, 85, 86, and 87, these are all one-time appropriations from 23. When you're looking through House Bill 1 and you see it growing from 400 plus sections to 605 sections, which is immense for a bill, each one of these funds has 2 sections because it's the appropriation plus it's the effective date. So we have 189, I think we counted, effective dates of June 30th, 2003, related to appropriations throughout House Bill 2. So if you cut those off, you're back closer to that 400 number. But all these new ones are all 2 or 3 sections that are added to House Bill 2. That's how House Bill 2 grows so large as far as sections. Cyanobacteria mitigation loan funds provided $1 million. PFAS remediation fund grants of $2 million. Nashua Litchfield, which was a separate bill, there's an interconnection project, $9.7 million. Offshore wind and fisheries was about $10,000. Surface water setbacks, and then the water assistance natural disaster program. They did 2 things. They decided to remove it out of 24, 25, but not fund at $5 million, to fund at $500,000. So there are two decisions they made there. Under transportation, rows 93 and 94, the House provided additional funds to match additional federal funds that became available for the rural and urban transit match in 24-25 is what the House did. The Senate decided to match these funds. We're going to use surplus funds from 23 from the general fund, and so that's why there's an addition of 1,883 in 23 to fund both those years, and then the corresponding reduction. So they still support the House position from the different bucket. On row 94, Mechanical Services Bureau of Equipment, the House provided almost $4.8 million of additional funding in general funds to the Highway Department of Transportation. The Senate supported that, but again, moved it back to 23. They were able to support the House, but also to keep their budget down. And then on row 98, Senator D'Alessandro had a bill for $40 million. We did this a couple years ago, we being the legislature, where we provided additional funds for municipal bridges and apportionment funding. I think it was about $40 million. Senator D'Alessandro's bills was 40. The Senate agreed, Senate Finance is agreeing to give him $10 million for additional municipal bridge appropriations and $10 million additional apportionment funding that goes to cities and towns. And then HHS. The 2 big ones coming at you. When you look at category 5 and 6 on a pie chart, Representative Weiler likes his pie charts. If you look at category 5 and 6, they're over 2/3 of the budget, just those 2 categories. Health and social services, row 102, they decided to reclassify some youth counselor positions. Initially, it was over $2 million that the department asked for. Senate Finance decided to give them half of that. So they'll give them $1 million to reclassify the youth counselor positions to help with some of that recruitment and retention. They did fund on row 133, Sununu Center overtime funding, and then on row 104, 251 family service specialists. This is one of the top priorities in order to recruit and retain family service specialists at DCYF. They needed to reclassify, and so this is almost $2.2 million to do that. 105, 2 things happened here. This is the New Heights Integrated Eligibility Audit. The House did fund that at $839,000 in total funds and general funds in 24. The Senate was provided new information by HHS that cost had come down, so it dropped down to $168,000, but they decided to fund that out of 23. When I say that Senate also benefits from later revenue estimates, they also benefit from more accurate predictions of spending levels from the agency. So you're going to start to see some reductions in HHS because of actuarial study on Medicaid care management, because contracts coming back, which the actual cost. So they benefit from all that information just as the days progress. And so they did find out on rows 106 and 107 that we can reduce general funds almost $2.9 million for consultation and strategic efforts and move that to reduce the general funds and just add federal funds to fund that. Federal funds did become available. 108 is a federal data services hub that's required by the federal government, but no funding, so they did provide $1 million in 25. 109 is your state phase down funding. This is your Part D. This is your clawback. There's 100 different terms for it, but it's your duly eligible Medicare and Medicaid patients for their drug costs. This is an item where fiscal committee, if you've sit on fiscal, you remember HHS coming with a couple statewide transfers. This is one of the lines they're usually transferring into because of the enrollment and the cost. They are required to pay out of general funds. This was one of the top 2 priorities of the department, so they added $15 million over the biennium for that. 110 was a benefit that the Senate Finance Committee had that the House did not have, and that was information, and it was an actuarial study of the cost, not only the projection cost of enrollment, but also the cost of care for the per member per month cost under the Medicaid care management program. So they were able to reduce their budget by 41.8 and 46.3, so almost $88 million of reductions that still provide the same level of services that the House provided, just with the updated revenues. Medicaid Management Information System, MMIS, that's 111 and 112. Governor had a 23 appropriation of $20 million. House put it into 24, 25, and with the federal match. Because the Senate was going with to reduce their budget, they decided to fund it how the governor did. One time out of 23, provide the ability for HHS to go to fiscal to accept those federal funds. So that line alone, that was another $87 million that they could bring their budget down, but still support the House's position. 113 and 114 are small. These are ARPA funds. These are the only 2 ARPA funds, other than the bipartisan infrastructure law, the only 2 ARPA funding. And there's probably $4 billion of federal funds in the budget. There's only 2 small ARPA ones in here of, almost $1.2 million. So those were removed, come back to fiscal and use that process, because ARPA is not going to be here forever. It feels like it's been here forever, but it's going to go away eventually. So 115 and 116 is Glencliff Home. Glencliff Home does take care of the elderly with some behavioral health issues and other needs, developmental disabilities, et cetera. They are funded with the general fund, but they also receive patient income. But if their census is down, which it is, they're not going to get that agency income. And in recognition of that, the Senate provided about $2.2 million in general funds so that they wouldn't have to reduce their budget, because their census is down and their the income will be lower, because they still have your same fixed cost to fund those same services. Crisis Stabilization Services in House Bill 1, that's another $5 million that the Senate provided. And then rows 118, 119, and 120 is something that Division 3 in House Finance tried to address. This is developmental services, acquired brain disorder, and children in home supports. So there's a dedicated fund for these appropriations that is restricted, continually appropriated, and non-lapsing to the department. The House recognized this. They were able to reduce some general funds, and they wanted to budget these funds from the dedicated fund, but also the federal match, and so they did. So on row 118, you can see a reduction of $50 million. What happened is the Senate Finance Committee was approached by HHS saying that they were talking to administrative services and then carry forward those funds and budgeting them as agency income could cause some issues. They're more comfortable if you were, there's a footnote. If you go into those lines, and I can email whoever's interested, there's a footnote on those lines recognizing that the amounts appropriated in House Bill 1 are in addition to those funds that are going to be carried forward. And it's higher than this 51 and the 5, almost 56. It's probably $70 million of funds that are sitting there in these dedicated funds that weren't spent for DD, ABD, and home supports. A lot of that because of utilization, but also the inability to find people to provide that care. But those funds automatically carry forward with statute. So between that and the other funds, that's another $65 million that the House was able to, so the Senate Finances was able to reduce their budget by, but still support the House's position. There was some other funding for New Hampshire Hospital Security, about $300,000, $350,000. On page 5, Medicaid unwind funding. So this is the result of the public health emergency, the emergency going away on a national level. The governor provided $16 million because that ended, the state of emergency ended, and people are de-enrolling, unenrolling from Medicaid. Initially, this HHS, the governor decided to put $16 million aside in 23 just in case. Well, that just in case never came to fruition, so that $16 million they did not have to spend for Medicaid unwind. HHS does believe their budget appropriations are sufficient. And just relative to DD, because DD is one of those developmental services and developmental disabilities, one of those big items and one of the second largest funding items in HHS. When you compare it to 22-23, even with that reduction of the $56 million from those dedicated funds, even though it's still available, it's still a 22.6% increase over 22-23 dollars. So that is there are plenty of funds. The department was comfortable. So I just wanted to, before I moved on, mention that. TANF maintenance of effort funding on row 125 is another $500,000 that they added. The House had reduced. They asked for it back, they being HHS. Increased funding for system of care residential rates. You remember a floor amendment adopted, I believe it was a floor amendment in the House that added $5 million to the system of care. HHS came back to the Senate, asked them if they were willing to add additional money, and they did. They added another 11.5, so the 16.5 in House Bill 2 for the system of care. In total, between 1 and 2 for system of care, I think it's about $67 million of support for that program. 127 is homeless services. That's $10 million. So when you're looking at your reductions of the Affordable Housing Fund and those other areas, this was one place that Senator Bradley thought was a bigger need for Senate Finance when they were having their debate. And he thought $8 million for shelter rates for homeless shelters and $2 million that will go to cities and towns to help them in the event there aren't any homeless shelters. You can at least provide people with cold weather shelter in a hotel or other areas. And then I will run through just kind of the big ones. Early childhood and mental health, that's row 130, that's $1 million. Home visiting programs, about $450,000. $2 million for family resource centers. Both the House and Senate in House Bill 2 have $1 million a year in 24-25 already. This is an additional $2 million in 23, so it's a total of $4 million across those 3 years. Recovery-friendly workforce program of $2.1 million. That was something the Senate was approached, I believe, by the governor's office, and it was one program I offered. The House removed. I'd like to have it back in, and that's something they agreed they would do. Juvenile grief peer-to-peer services, about $500,000. Juvenile diversion on row 135. There are funds in the budget for juvenile diversion. The department did ask for an additional funds. So what the Senate decided is they'll give them $600,000 from 23 in addition to their budget amounts, but also another $300,000 a year in 24-25 to provide those juvenile diversion services in the counties. 136 and 137, those House members have been around here for a while. Senator D'Alessandro for years, probably over 12 years now, has been pushing to have foster grandparents and congregate housing added back into the budget. It's been suspended. Those two programs, along with graduate medical education programs since 2011. The Senate initially said no, and they denied Senator D'Alessandro's amendment. But later on in the week, they came back and decided we will provide you with, for the next biennium for 24-25, with foster grandparent funding of about $200,000 and congregate housing of about $1.5 million for the next 2 years. It's about $750 a year. Funded a new system of care for healthy aging, so not for the children, which the regular system of care is really geared towards, but this is for the elderly aging population. It funds public health department vaccine administration for just standard vaccines for any public health department that needs assistance and isn't receiving federal support. To do that, they do have some general funds here. You do have Medicaid coverage programs for mothers, so this is row 140. You'll see a negative 200 in the House column, and that's because the House provided $200,000 for postpartum care for Medicaid postpartum care. The Senate deleted that but funded it at $600,000 in 23. So 600 of that 1.45 million is related to postpartum care. The other funds are related to donor breast milk, doula care, and other services to women. WIC Farmers Market Nutrition Programs on row 141. There's $600,000 of general funds in addition to the WIC funds that are available from the federal government. Brain Health Public Awareness 142. There was also a Senate bill that they appropriated $500,000 in 23 to fund that. One of the larger appropriations that they had, and they added near the end of their process, Senate Finance process, row 143, is Child Care Workforce Assistance. There was a Senate bill that appropriated, I think it was $15 million, but it was an ongoing child care workforce development fund. The majority of the Finance Committee decided we support it, but we don't want to make it an ongoing program. We know we have funds in 23 that you can use over the next couple of years. So we're going to appropriate $15 million for the purpose of recruitment and retaining child care workforce, using the structure of that child care workforce development fund, just not setting it up in RSA and making it an ongoing program. Graduated public assistance, the so-called benefit cliff, another $200,000 was appropriated. And then a small one, 145. It's small for 46,048, but what it does is DOIT and Fish and Game need some assistance from Department of Information Technology, and they were willing to pay for it if the legislature paid for it. And so the legislature did provide, Senate Finance did provide this to them. Category 6 is where you're going to see a lot of your big changes from the General Education Trust Fund. And as I stated previously, the big decision, and it was one of the decisions that happened near the end, was we as a Senate Finance Committee, where are we comfortable with this tax splits? And Senator Bradley was 59-41, which is roughly current law between General Fund and Education Trust Fund and business taxes, not 60-40, not rounding up, not going anywhere else. So it was 59-41. That is put into statute that way. That actually makes it easier for DRA to report, because now when the business tax come in, they'll be split to the various pots, instead of the current system where they have to look at which tax is applied, which year, when was it increased, and how much goes to each fund. So, but what you're going to see on rows 149 and 150 has a no net impact to your General Education Trust Fund on a combined basis, but does impact each fund. Your other state aid, your building aid, tuition and transportation, special education, building aid lease, was going to be moved to the Education Trust Fund based on that decision of the Senate Finance to keep the status quo in the split. So that's a reduction in general funds of 89.2 and 89.4. Doesn't really help them get to that 750 million target that they had, because you're going to see in the second line Education Trust Fund, because currently in 23, building aid, tuition, transportation, and special ed are funded from the General Education Trust Fund. It was moved back, so that's a net zero. Adequate education aid, including charter school tuition. They added roughly, if you take into the two lines, the one below it is a surplus statement adjustment based on the House proposal on education funding. So it's about 8 and 4. It's almost $12 million that was added relative to adequate education aid. And I'm going to do a terrible job explaining what this does. Mickey's behind me, and feel free to talk to him after. But basically, the Senate was in a position where the House knows what the Senate proposed, and the House had their own proposal, and they wanted to put more of the money to the property poor communities. The Senate was put in a position where they wanted to do the same thing, but they wanted to get rid of the stabilization grant. Unfortunately, when you get rid of the stabilization grant, you're hitting the same communities that you're trying to keep hold harmless and keep whole and provide the additional money to. So Senator Lang worked with Senator Bradley and department and the governor's office to come up with, and met with a couple of the House members to come up with their plan to target some of those additional funds. Yes, increase base adequacy, but put more of the funding, put a lot of the funding into those, it's called extraordinary needs, which is based on free and reduced lunch, and I believe the property tax evaluation per pupil. So that was a big change. Even though it shows a small amount here, you'll notice in the end of this packet is a town by town that shows the 3 proposals. So it's more than just the dollars when it comes to education funding. 153, reducing tuition and transportation aid of about $4.4 million. They were approached, I believe, by the department and with just some concerns of a maintenance of effort, an ongoing maintenance of effort. Once you're at a certain level in tuition and transportation, you have to maintain that. As a result, the Senate did take this reduction of about 4.4 of the biennium. Again, the Senate meets tomorrow. I'm sure there'll be floor amendments on a lot of these issues where you'll see that reduction. Court-ordered placements 154 and 155, similar to 149 and 150, is more just moving court-ordered placements back to Education Trust Fund where it is now because they didn't change their splits. Episodic treatment, excuse me, that was a House bill. The House decided to fund that as 4.1 and 5.1, and that's related to court-ordered placements, but also special education services for those kids who can't receive those services in the public school and need an outside entity. These are additional funds. Right now, the school districts are absorbing those costs in their existing budgets, and so the House did decide to provide almost $9.2 million to take care of this issue. Senate had pulled that out, and then later on in the process decided to fund it, and similar to court-ordered placements to fund it, and special ed to fund it from the Education Trust Fund. So they appropriate $19.2 million in '23 for the next biennium for episodic treatment. So they support the House's position on episodic treatment, but they'll fund it in a different manner. Medicaid direct certification 158. This is related to your free and reduced school lunch population. Medicaid direct certification will kind of cut down a lot of that paperwork for the cities and community school districts relative to free and reduced lunch meals and applications. It was something that the House had proposed. There was also a separate bill. The Senate decided to remove that and to establish a study committee not only on Medicaid direct certification but also on the increase to the free and reduced lunch threshold at the federal poverty level. So as far as this budget's concerned, there was about $320,000 that was budgeted because the larger impact of Medicaid direct certification happens next biennium because it does require federal approval and some startup time for the districts to get ready. So right now, again, this is one item we'll be debating on the floor tomorrow. But as of right now, the Senate Finance Committee is removing that. They deleted Senate Finance, the Teacher of the Year funding of $250,000. Sugar River Valley, 160, 161. House funded it with general funds because they had the general funds. CTEs, if you remember, recent memory is they were funded out of the capital budget. The governor proposed funding out of the Education Trust Fund, House General Fund. The Senate decided to fund it out of the Education Trust Fund in '23. So you can see on row 161. But they didn't stop there because the next one down, Winnisquam Regional CTE, when the House passed the budget, you had $7.6 million in House Bill 25. When the Senate adopted House Bill 25, the capital budget, they had the same $7.65 million because they made very little changes to House Bill 25 that the House proposed. But recognizing the amount of money that was in the Education Trust Fund, recognizing the additional cost of a bond, you'll see it's kind of a unique section where it negates the bond authorization in House Bill 25 and instead funds with 7.65. So what will happen if both bills pass? That project for Winnisquam will be funded with Education Trust Fund cash rather than a bond. Deletes Division of Analytics position that was funded. Provided funding for new full-day kindergarten programs as they were notified by DOE that 2 districts did approve new kindergarten, full-day kindergarten for the fall. It could be Messinic and Winnisquam, I could be wrong. But they did put that money aside to fund those. On page 6, Computer Science Professional Development Program, $4 million. It was one of the last ads that the Senate added against 23. Civics textbooks. Governor had 2, House had 0, Senate's proposing 1, Senate Finance. Additional funding for adult education, $500,000 of additional funding for adult education programs at DOE. I believe that was Senator Rosenwald. Funds 168, an educator recruitment program. You'll see it on here. That was a Senate bill, but they are requiring them to identify ARPA funds or ESSER funds, the elementary and secondary education funds that are available from the federal government. And then provides additional funding for the Public School Infrastructure Fund. The commissioner approached Senate Finance to ask for, or notified them of almost $21 million of applications they received for security upgrades at public schools. The Senate was willing to fund $10 million of that out of the Education Trust Fund. And then 170, the SNAP free and reduced set aside. Because when the House adopted their business tax splits, they wanted to make sure before funding, closing out the Education Trust Fund, that they at least recognize the fact that the SNAP free and reduced lunch back in the fall, the fiscal committee approved an increase for SNAP, which is the food stamps, to 200%. As a result, that had an impact on your free and reduced count. And so the House wanted to set aside $10 and $20 million, kind of just a placeholder, because you didn't want to throw the Education Trust Fund into a situation where those numbers started to require additional general funds. The Senate removed that because of the large balance they have in the Education Trust Fund, similar to what the governor had. He had a large balance, did not have a free and reduced set aside. That money is already authorized in statute. It will come through the normal, the regular traditional adequacy calculation. And then 170, 172 are not mistypes. There was $150,000 for a charitable gaming study commission. And because that was so good, Senate Bill 51 passed with $250,000 for the same study of charitable gaming. So there's $400,000 between Senate Bill 51 and House Bill 2 to study charitable gaming in New Hampshire. Police standards and training, 173 was a new court security officer training program. The judicial branch approached police standards and training, asked if they would certify and train and license their officers, the court security officers, and they agreed to if they could. They did need a couple positions, and so that was funded by the Senate. Reduced dual and concurrent enrollment, a $750,000 reduction in each year. It is above it's right in between the governor and House level. I think that the governor had about 2 million, House had about 3.25, and so the Senate is right about 2.5 a year. The Promise program at CCS&H, initially removed by the Senate of $3 million a year. And then a week went by, and CCS&H and other those interested in this program did convince the Senate Finance Committee to provide $3 million one-time appropriation for the Promise program, which is to provide tuition assistance to those Pell-eligible students. First Responder Career Development Program, $1 million. That was a separate Senate bill. There was a reduction to the USNH funding of $200,000 in 24 and $6.2 million in 25, and that was to bring them down to $190 over the biennium. That's why you have the different numbers. They were a little higher in the second year. So that UNH will get $190 million over the next biennium, which is about 12 to 13 million over what they received on the current biennium. House deleted the interoperability of blockchain program and funding. That's $1.5 million, and then added, I think Senator Innes possibly, a $3 million appropriation to the University System of New Hampshire to be matched by the university system, so that Plymouth State and Keene State received additional support. So $3 million general funds. They're hoping that USNH will provide an additional $3 million so that Plymouth and Keene will receive the additional $6 million once you add that match. And then other adjustments. This is more LBA type stuff, but on row 183, increase the general fund lapse due to statewide position vacancies. It's 2.5 and 5 million, not big when I show you the lapses for the general funds. The state does have a 20+% vacancy rate, high as 40, high as 60 in some agencies. So what a lapse is basically appropriations that aren't going to be spent. And what happens is if you're budgeting over 2 years and you want to make sure you have the proper positions, you'll receive that funding, but what happens is people retire, you can't fill those positions, or maybe it's a little longer to fill, and so there's what we call a lapse, basically unspent money, and so that's something the legislature looks at. And then 184 and 185, when statutory appropriations for the general fund, like your abandoned claims, and any other statutory appropriations that don't require fiscal or any other settlements, workers' comp claims, they had to add, they being Senate Finance, about $5.5 million over what the House had, and that is just because of year-to-date activity. That's a number that I'll put on, my office will put on, separate from any vote. We're just reflecting the actuals. Same with Education Trust Fund, $10.3 million over what was drawn on the, they call them warrants, against the Education Trust Fund automatically via statute to pay for adequacy and all those costs. So it was 10.3 higher by the time the Senate completed their work than now. So in total in 23, the Senate did add $80.5 million of additional funds, total funds, about $30 million in general, $50 million in Education Trust Fund, $20 million of that is the CTE. But they were able to get there with the additional revenue, with decisions they made on some of the unfunded accrued liability and some of those other programs. And then 24, 25. If you add up your 389 and 365, you're pretty close to your 750 that the Senate, you're going to hear the $750 million. And how does that hit? The general fund is roughly about $320 million. but that's because of the move of some of your other state aid back to the general fund in addition to the reductions. Education trust fund increased by 89 and 72, again, because of the move back to the education trust fund when compared to the House of all those, your other state aid programs. Federal funds, 135 and 108, so almost $240 million of federal fund reductions as a result of the bipartisan infrastructure law was really the largest ones, and then any of the matches at HHS that they no longer have to carry for 24-25. Very little highway funds, very little fish and game funds, and then other fund changes, 184.2 and 158. 124 of that's coming from your meals and rooms because it does have that fund, a dedicated fund separately, as well as your other funds for that carry forward for the DD services. So that's how the Senate got to where they, the current budget that they have. On page 7 is the general fund, and it's more just an illustration of decisions made during the governor's phase that he had, what the House made, Senate, for the 3 years. And you can see the variance of just the revenues themselves. If you just look on row 6, you can see that the House 2.08, almost over 100 million lower in the Senate, but that's because of the business tax split change. You're going to see that number in ETF and revenues be higher in 24, and then 1.881 compared to 2.061 in 25, and budget appropriations following that. Lapse estimates, just point out quickly, it looks like the House made the Senate Finance is making a big increase in the lapse estimate, but when you go to 11, and the lapse estimate, the governor had 129.9. The reason the House is at 109.36 is because they had allowed HHS to use some of their lapse to fund the MMIS on an ongoing basis. Because the Senate agreed with the governor on funding it from 23 instead, they bumped their lapse back to 129.9, then added another $30 million in lapse because of House Bill 2023, the energy bill, which didn't have the pickup that was anticipated. So right now, the lapse estimate is 159.9. I don't have a crystal ball, but because of the vacancy rate, I would not be surprised that that's higher. But by the time we close out the fiscal year, over the last couple of years, they're pushing close to $200 million in the second year of the biennium for a lapse. So it's just we don't know how high it will go, and that's one of those mystery numbers we don't find out until 3 months after the close of the fiscal year. But that's just something to keep an eye on. But absent any legislative action, if the lapse does increase, that's just additional money that goes to the general fund unless there's other decisions made between now and then. And then 68.7 going into the rainy day fund in 23 and 3.2. Revenues, if you're interested in revenues or in Ways and Means, you can see on page 8 the general fund revenues, the split between. So these are your standard current law revenues. So this won't impact any of the split decisions or anything. So you can see the governor in 23 was at 1.948. With the newest numbers, Senate's over $2 billion of revenue to the general fund, which is one of the first times we're that high. In 24, the governor about a little under 1.9, House at 1.187, and the Senate at 1.92. These are your base estimates. And then the governor at about 1.872, House pretty close, and 25, 10 million below, and then the Senate at 1.906 based on collections. But that does show an estimate of decreases in 24 and 25 in your base revenues that reflect all the action that the legislature took. I will not go over rows 9, page 9, 10, and 11, but on page 9, when we talk about splits and you talk about revenue adjustments and why does the Senate have such a big education trust fund balance, you're going to see in the general fund, right on row 8, your total adjustments. So I just showed you the base revenue estimates from the Ways and Means Committee on current law. But you can see the governor had about, I think it was about $75 million a year in additional general funds as a result of his switches on 2 and 3. The House had about $220 million a year that went to the general fund to the benefit. And the Senate was about $1 million a year because they kept them close to current law. So if you look on row 8, you can see between the House and the Senate, almost a $220 million difference between what's available in the general fund, between what's available in the education trust fund, and then same thing on row 8, all the way up to the right-hand column. Row 9 is all if you're interested to look through this or have questions, let me know. It's the governor, House, and Senate. In those areas where you see, like if I look to the state employee pay raise in row 28, when you see all the numbers the same, that means it was in the governor, House, and Senate budget. If it was in, row down 133, you'll see it, House and Senate budget for electronic licensing. If it's just in the Senate column, that means it's a new program. It's a look for a House Bill 2 section. These are all in House Bill 2, all these adjustments. So there are several pages of that. On page 12, just to give you a size of magnitude of 23 spending, so counting almost $300 million of expenditures from statutory law, but 200 plus, 20 million plus of appropriations in 2022. In 23, above and beyond the budget that was passed 2 years ago in 2021, the Senate is estimating spending about $618 million, so over $500 million. The House had about $538 million, and this is because of the additional revenue that's coming in over plan. It's significant, and it's not something that I've seen where we've had 2 straight years of over 400 plus million of revenue above plan, but as a result, the legislature made some decisions on what their priorities were on what to spend. And then in 24 and 25, you can see a different appropriations adjustments. The House at about 168, Senate at 130. Again, 25 million of that's related to the retirement. And then 181 and 143 in 25. And then page 13. And sorry if I'm going slow. I did the Senate presentation about a half an hour because I heard it for the last month and a half, so I'm just making sure that I can try to give you all the information you have prior to their floor vote tomorrow. Education Trust Fund, 23, Governor, House, and Senate all come $108 million forward. Revenue, pretty close, between $30 million between the Governor, House, and Senate, and that's current law. And your appropriations at about 109.6 and then 1146 in 23. You'll see why the Senate is up in the total appropriations because of your CTE, because of the Public School Infrastructure Fund and those other uses. So the current year balance in the governor's 113, House 75, Senate, knowing that the Education Trust Fund is going to have a big balance at the end of 25, spent a little more. Current year balance, just current year revenues, is 25 million, added to the 108 on row 1. There's 133 million in the Senate's position compared to 183 at the end of 23, current law, current business tax splits, et cetera. We'll move over to 24, 25. Balance forwards are the same. It's the revenue. So if you look at the governor's total revenue into the Education Trust Fund, and that's assuming a 65-35 split, 65% general fund, 35% Education Trust Fund is at 1.217. The House at 77.5% general fund, 22.5% education trust fund is at 1.04, so there's that $200 million swing. And then you can see the Senate kept it at 59.41, so it's even higher. So the Senate has 41% of business tax revenues going to the education trust fund versus the 35 that the House had, the governor had, I'm sorry. So 1.276 offset by $1.221.6 million in revenue. So the Education Trust Fund is growing. 18, you see another $54 million added to the Education Trust Fund, bringing the total balance to 187. And that carries forward into 25. And that's what happens in the Senate. You have a higher revenue, appropriations that are lower than those revenues, so the Education Trust Fund will grow in their plan, Senate Finance Plan, by the end of the biennium, ending at 236.3. $236.3 million sitting in the Education Trust Fund at the end of 25 compared to the governor's 148. So that's, and the House they're pretty close. Remember that set aside, the House had about $30 million to make sure the Education Trust Fund was made whole. So they did have to transfer some education general funds to make the Education Trust Fund whole in the House plan. If we go over to row 14, you can see the revenues. They're actually, this is current law, so this is the current business tax splits, and you can see the governor at 1.2, House and Senate pretty close in 23 for Education Trust Fund revenue, and then pretty close, the governor had 1.1292, House and Senate within $14 million of base Education Trust Fund revenue, and then about 10 million to 11 million in 25 is how close they are on your base revenues. And then your adjustments of Again, on row 5 is your total revenue adjustments. You can see the 75 million. I mentioned that the governor moved over from the education trust fund to the general fund by changing those splits. House was at 223. 1.1 million is what the Senate was, because they wanted to stay as close to current law as possible. And you can see in 24-25, very similar. And then the major difference I think you're going to see is in 23 are your additional 23 education trust fund appropriations, Sugar River Valley, Winnisquam, Public School Infrastructure Fund, episode of treatment, et cetera. And then there's neither the House or Senate funded on row 14, the 75 million in additional school building aid that the governor had proposed. EFA appropriation reduction that was adopted on the House floor. The Senate kept it identical to what the House passed. So it's the same funding level, same parameters that the House passed on. And then you can see the set-asides coming off on row 18 just because of the balance in that fund was part of that decision. Row 16, I won't go down, but this is the highway fund surplus statement. It's one page. It will show you the governor, House, and Senate finance, where they thought the bienniums would end. I'm going to jump to 25. Governor had assumed about $13 million in the highway fund at the end of 25 based on revenues and expenditures in the House budget. That was about $7.2 million. And that's including $10 million in general fund support that the House provided. The Senate maintained that $10 million of general fund support to the highway fund, and they end about $12.4 million because of higher revenues, but some other changes to their appropriations. And then Fish and Game, this keeps getting smaller. So Fish and Game has its own surplus statement. It's a dedicated fund. You can see in 23, the governor House had about $9.2 million, $9.3 million. Only difference between the governor and the House were the revenue estimates. Senate Finance jumped all the way to 11.3, but the reason for that is because of the $2 million in general fund support that the Senate provided in House Bill 2. So at the end of 25, the Fish and Game Fund, governor assumed $4.5 million. Their ending balance, House had the same 4.5. Senate was close, but then added that $2 million back in 23, so they're up to Senate 0.1, and that's assuming 7.1, so that assumes current revenues and the appropriations provided to Fish and Game. And then on page 18 is all the state aid to cities and towns, and so on the far right is your aid by category: education, environmental, other, highway funds. What the actual in 22 was, so statewide, $1.22 billion. 23 budget at $1.31 billion, and then you have two columns each for each body. You can see what the governor provided, about 1.28 and 1.297 in state aid to cities and towns, versus the 1.2 and 1.3. House provided 1.3 and 1.32, so almost $2.63 billion, and then the Senate Finance provided 1.35 and 1.324, so close to 2.7, not really, to 2.6 or so. Million, $2.67 billion of funding, and then you can see just by where they are. Senate obviously has a couple one-offs with your CTE and your, I think the $9.7 million for the Nashua Litchfield is in there as well. And then on page 19 is kind of a glimpse into the head of Mickey Landergan, who works with us on education funding, and the budget is never difficult enough. You always want to throw in education funding in there as well. It makes it so much simpler. So the governor had his proposal, the House had their proposal. Mickey was running various proposals for the House, various proposals for the Senate. But at each change, every member wanted to know, well, what did the governor do? What did the House do? What did the Senate do? Not versus current law. And so we put this, or Mickey put this 7-column sheet together that 24, 25 are both the same, $962 billion for adequacy grants to towns. And you can see it's a town by town through the end of this presentation. What did the governor recommend and how did the towns fare? What passed the House and how did that fare? And then the Senate Finance proposal, the final proposal of Senate Finance. This obviously still needs ratification in the body tomorrow, but you can see the variances between, if I were to organize them a little differently just for you to see, you can see that if you move the Senate Finance column in between the governor and the House, as far as those property poor communities or those with higher free and reduced lunch, they're kind of right in between the governor and the House. So this is a town by town, and we have, if you go to our website, on the General Court website, the fourth up top, the fourth tab is the LBA. You want to open budget and revenue documents, and you will see all of our briefings. If you click on Senate Finance, you'll see all there. They have recap sheets where they monitor and keep track of all their amendments they offer, as well as every education funding spreadsheet by component that are available as well. So sorry for going so long, but I can answer any questions if you have them, or feel free to stop by State House 101 and 102, talk to our analysts. We'll get the right person up to give you the detail, and just let us know if you need anything. Yes, hi, Representative Boley.
Yes, just a quick question on line 85, the Nashua-Litchfield interconnection project. My town engineer tried to get involved in that because we have 2 wells in Litchfield. And we were told Hudson isn't part of that, even though we draw water from Litchfield. And we are part of the sewer connection with Nashua. What happened?
So that I'm going to direct you to the senator themselves.
Oh, come on.
Yeah, sorry, that was a Senate bill of $9.7 million as opposed to going to the other fund. So that was a decision that the senators had. I don't know the reasons behind it. We'll try to track that information down with you or point you to the right senator.
It's Rosenfeld.
Could be Rosenwald. Rosenwald is one. Yep. Yep. Okay. You're welcome.
So, Mike, on the, for example, when a lot of this moving money around, like rooms and meals tax, for example, taking it off budget, should it also be somehow off budget on the revenue list, like page 8, for example?
Already is. So all the meals and rooms, the numbers that you see in your base revenues already assume the carve out for the meals and rooms that are going to cities and towns. So even though it was in the budget, it was as other, it was just a recognition of that carve out. So there was no additional adjustment necessary. So basically, absent that carve out, the meals and rooms revenue in your base would have been $240 million higher over the biennium.
Well, look at page 8, for example, general fund.
Yep.
So there's no difference between House and Senate for rooms and meals, roughly.
For base revenue, correct. And base revenue does assume that carve out to the municipal fund for that distribution. So that 300, so if you look at meals and
Oh, it's
meals,
already gone?
it's already taken out.
Even
yes.
from the House side?
Yes, even from the House side. Governor, House, and all have it removed already.
But in the House budget, it's in other?
It showed up as other.
Yes, okay. good.
Correct.
My second question is, let's go to page, let's talk about all the moving of money to 23. So for example, on page 5. So there's a giant list here of HHS stuff, family mutual support services, LNA reimbursement, all moving into 23, right?
Yes.
Are these ongoing programs that are going to come back next biennium, or are these one-time things?
It varies. The homeless services is a one-time $10 million. Is that something, I would consider that up to the next, I'd leave that up to the next legislature to decide whether or not they wanted to fund that. Family mutual support, it's only $50,000. That could be something ongoing. I'm just trying to find one that could be peer-to-peer services, juvenile grief. There are some of these programs, although they're getting one-time funds in 23, by the time 24-25 biennium is over, they may be ongoing programs, but that's up to the legislature. Foster grandparents and Congress at one time, that's just suspension, is just through the biennium. Your Medicaid coverage, as you know, on Division 3, is that something that's ongoing? So I think it's a mix, Representative.
So wouldn't we say it's a bad practice to fund ongoing programs with last year's leftover money rather than this year's revenue? Because next biennium we're going to find ourselves way short. Yeah.
It's a practice. I wouldn't label it good or bad. It's definitely a practice, and as you know, all of these items are going to be debated in 26 and 27 to decide whether or not they're ongoing. I think you have varying opinions on what's the proper way. I think the Senate on probably 80% of all their appropriations wanted to make sure they're one time in 23, and that was the thought process behind that. They probably do recognize that some of these may continue in 26, 27 beyond, but I leave that up to the legislature to make that determination.
One last question. The item that's coming out of House Bill 25, are we simply going to be borrowing less money than we would have otherwise?
Yes, $7.6 million less, correct.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could shed some light possibly on looking at the USNH budget coming out of the Senate on page 6, the reduction at 177, that 6.2 million in FY25. Can you say anything about how that number was arrived at, what the target of that reduction is in 25?
Yeah, so the Senate had a lot of meetings with UNH, both in and separately. The goal of that reduction was to make sure that UNH's total appropriation was 190. Why 190? That was a number communicated to them by the university system that they could live with. Obviously, they would like a higher amount if the legislature was willing, but 190 was a figure that they could live with. And so the Senate agreed to fund them at, I think it's about even. It's even in each fiscal year, but 190 over the two, so about 95 in each year.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. All right, so that's all I have for questions. Again, feel free to email any members of our staff, stop by and ask, and pay attention to the floor debate tomorrow. We're going to pay attention to see what floor amendments are adopted that could change this. Okay, thank you.